So before I introduce our presenter, I just want to once again welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this CARLA talk. So today we are really pleased to welcome Darren LaScotte, who is a PhD candidate in second language education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction here at the University of Minnesota. He is also one of our CARLA Fellows, and that's why he's presenting for us today. The title of his talk today is Affordance or Constraint, Exploring Shifts in L2 Pronunciation, Reported Ideologies, and Actual Teaching Practices in the Classroom Ecology. So welcome, Darren.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So I just wanted to begin by contextualizing the research. So as Kate Faisani said, my talk is looking at shifts in L2 pronunciation, reported teaching ideologies, and then the actual practices in the classroom ecology. But the research that I'm doing is in the context of international teaching assistant programs. I do see in chat and through the participant list that there are some people who are very familiar with these programs, but I did want to give a brief introduction to ITA programs in case there are those joining us who are not as familiar. So since the late 1970s, universities across the United States have increasingly recruited and relied on international graduate students for a substantial part of their teaching labor and in their graduate studies in general. And often, as part of their tuition funding packages, these international graduate students are hired as teaching assistants or lower division or introductory, often gatekeeping courses with little to no preparation from their actual departments in terms of delivery of those courses. And so early on in the late 1970s, early 1980s, it became clear that some international teaching assistants or ITAs struggled to communicate course content to their students or to respond to impromptu questions or comments in class. And so in response, many universities have created programs and other resources to help ITA students improve their English intelligibility in teaching contexts. Unlike general English as a second language programs or ESL programs, these ITA programs have focused more on the suprasegmental pronunciation aspects of the English language with key terms from academic disciplines, teaching skills, and then cultural differences that ITAs may encounter as they perform their duties as TAs. So zooming in on our context here at the University of Minnesota, where I'm doing my research, the first ITA or the first communication skills class for TAs course was offered at the University of Minnesota in the fall or winter quarter of 1978. At that time through the linguistics department, which housed the ESL program. And in 1978, there was no university-wide language policy or language standard for TAs. So the students who signed up for this course did so strictly on a voluntary basis. It was an elective class and reported great success with that. Between the winter quarter of 1978 and spring of 1983, more than 100 TAs participated in that first ITA program or iteration of the ITA program. However, in May of 1983, two representatives of the Minnesota legislature, Connie Levy and James Swanson, became aware of what was sometimes at the time termed the quote unquote foreign TA problem because of the experiences that their children had who were enrolled at the Institute of Technology at the university. And at the time of this 1983 law that was kind of up and coming, stories about ITAs and their students quickly circulated in news media discourse, and a TA's ability to teach seemed to be directly connected to undergraduate students' perceptions of that TA's language proficiency, whether undeserved or not. So students like Ms. Kendra Benham, who is quoted here, this is from an article from the Minneapolis Star and Tribune, as it was once called. I'll just read this for everyone. Kendra Benham said her upbringing in Prior Lake hadn't prepared her for the surprise she got when she entered the University of Minnesota last fall. she couldn't understand one of her teachers. By the second day of the math class, she said she realized that the teaching assistant's, foreign accent was too thick for her, so she signed up for another class. Another student, a freshman, Rob Walsh, had the same problem. He's quoted as saying that he struggled for 2 quarters to master the accents of 2 teaching assistants, as well as the mathematics that they were explaining. So in response to this concern from students, concerned parents, and other constituents at the university, Representatives Levy and Swanson persuaded their colleagues to include in a major spending bill a request that the university develop a plan for, quote, ensuring that teaching assistants are proficient in speaking, reading, and writing the English language as it is spoken in the United States. Screening for non-native English-speaking students began pursuant to this 1983 legislative request, and then included in the Minnesota laws in 1984 and 1985 were requests for the university to continue to develop and maintain a plan of action, which has resulted in the official creation of the language policy at the university, still in effect since 1985. A version of this policy still exists today, and the screening process that was set up in the early 1980s remains relatively similar. And if there are questions about that later, I can talk about that. So 40 years from now, or 40 years from the creation of this language policy, where are we now? We don't talk about teaching assistants, foreign accents being too thick, or in the same deficit-oriented way that was popular in the 80s. In fact, I did a language policy analysis of the news media discourse surrounding this particular policy at the University of Minnesota and the ITA program, which was published in the Modern Language Journal last year. And over the past 40 years, it seems that we've moved discursively from talking about the ITA problem as resolving an issue with TAs foreign accents being too thick or having a lack of adequate language proficiency, and have moved discursively to talking about the need to teach international teaching assistants teaching skills which happen to be culturally specific, or equipping ITAs with confidence so that they can carry out their duties as TAs. So in other words, what seems to have began as strictly a language policy focused on language proficiency has seemed to move, at least discursively, from one that is more focused on a pedagogical issue, not a language one, one focused on teaching. So I want to stress here that I do not mean to say or suggest that language proficiency is not related to teaching ability, because it is. It is related. Teaching is a highly context-dependent activity, and the things that get described as good behaviors or practices, or quote-unquote good teaching, can differ widely across individuals, across academic disciplines, larger social or cultural groups. And yet, a teacher's proficiency in the language of instruction is often one of the main considerations when it comes to judgments related to that teacher's capability. Language proficiency has also been shown to influence teachers' own confidence and beliefs about their pedagogical capabilities, what is sometimes termed as self-efficacy in teaching. And Fayez et al., who did a meta-analysis of the research on self-efficacy and its relation to language proficiency, their results of that study suggest that teachers that have a high self-efficacy or a high belief of their capabilities to teach are often more motivated, they persist longer when faced with adversity, they have a better teaching performance, display greater commitment to teaching, and can positively impact their students' overall achievement in their classes. So as such, it seems that a teacher's communicative effectiveness and their own beliefs, their own self-confidence about their language proficiency and teaching abilities are important matters for teacher educators to consider, as are the impacts of these programs like the ITA program on students' perceptions of their teaching ability, their language proficiency, because it has such an impact on their students. So my dissertation research, which I'm reporting on part today, is looking at that impact actually of the ITA program on students' perceptions of their language proficiency, of their teaching capabilities, and then also investigating the extent to which students carry over the things that they learn from the ITA program into their actual instructional contexts, so going into their classrooms. The research questions that guided my study are as follows. Because of the time that I have today, and because I want to make sure we have time for questions, I'm really focusing on the first research question and reporting on those results, which is what aspects of ITA's English pronunciation and multimodal discourse practices shift over the course of one semester in both micro-teaching lectures, which they perform as part of their ITA program, and then the authentic teaching observations, which refers to my observing them and recording them teaching in their actual classrooms. I'm going to color those results with some of the described changes that came from interviews with these participants, and then the extent to which things that they said that they do were actually evident in those recordings that I collected as part of data. So to answer those research questions, I carried out a multi-method case study approach to trace this process over time with 3 individuals. And it's multi-method because I'm drawing on multiple methods of data analysis to look at English pronunciation and shifts in that, as well as multimodal discourse practices. And the data I collected came from last semester in fall of 2022. So the participants that volunteered to participate in the study, they came from a range of backgrounds, both in terms of major coursework and degrees that they were seeking, countries, first languages, but they had in common that they all had arrived just before the start of the fall semester in the United States, and that this was their first time teaching, leading their own discussion section and teaching their own course. So they had that in common. They were also all concurrently enrolled in the ITA program at the time and learning about different teaching practices and techniques that they could carry over and apply to their teaching right away. Data for my study include field notes of classroom observations. So I sat in on the ITA program course each week, as well as some of the field notes taken from the micro teaching demonstrations I viewed and my observations of their teaching. Video recordings that I analyzed include the 3 short micro teaching demonstrations, which you might be able to guess what that refers to by the name that's given. But these are short teaching demonstrations where ITAs prepare a lesson, perform it over the course of 10 minutes in front of the ITA program instructors, as well as some undergraduate students as well, and then get feedback on their performance. Video recordings of a mirroring project, which was accumulation of different things, aspects of L2 English pronunciation they were working on, and weekly pronunciation language labs that they had, and then 3 teaching observations where they welcomed me into their classroom and I observed full 50-minute lessons. Those were recorded as well. After preliminary review of that data, looking at my field notes and things I observed in the recordings, I also had about 1-hour interviews with each of the participants, and that happened in late December. So for the 2 different methods I carried out to analyze in response to my research question, the first is about shifts in L2 English pronunciation. And so to look at shifts in pronunciation, I actually looked at 2 different measures. The first was subjective holistic ratings of categories that I called intelligibility, which had to do with language proficiency on the ITA rater form, and delivery, which had more to do with teaching skills, engagement with the audience, projected confidence, things like that. The micro teaching demonstrations were rated by the ITA program instructors. And then I had other unbiased but trained raters rate the first several minutes of those longer 50-minute recordings that I recorded when I visited their classrooms. Those raters were not part of the ITA program, but had a lot of experience teaching international students, a lot of experience teaching pronunciation. And we went over the categories of the ratings, and they had some training on those before they did their rating. I used a statistical measure, Fleiss's kappa, to look at inter-rater agreement across categories within those two larger groups of intelligibility and delivery. And that demonstrated substantial agreement on those ratings, which means that they largely agreed on the ratings that they were giving these ITA participants on the rater form. So the ratings I'm going to report for the subjective holistic ratings are averages of the ratings that they received from those forms and composite scores under the different categories. I think that'll be a little more clear when we look at the graphs that I made about those. In addition to subjective holistic ratings of intelligibility or language proficiency and then teaching skills or delivery, I also looked at objective measures of acoustic analysis. And that's because a lot of research has shown that over time, our ears can become trained to aspects of pronunciation, that maybe we just become better listeners or more sympathetic listeners. And so I also wanted to look at objective measures using speech analysis software to see if there's changes in participants' speech. So I looked at two correlates of intelligibility based on past research on L2 English pronunciation. The first was on pitch range, because a lot of research has shown that non-native English speakers tend to have a more compressed or narrow pitch range. It depends on what their first language, of course, but a lot of research has shown that there tends to be a more compressed pitch range. And so that often makes it more difficult for them to mark tone unit boundaries or relative prominence or focus in their speech. So I'm looking for an increased pitch range, which demonstrates that they're able to vary their pitch more consistently to mark for those things. In addition to pitch range, I also looked at mean intensity, which we perceive as volume. And so I'm thinking about, I'm sure there are many teachers here in the webinar, you can think about the projected teacher voice, right? So that people are able to understand and hear those shifts in prominence and focus as TAs introduce concepts, answer students' questions, and deliver their lectures. Speaking with a louder volume, not shouting, of course, but can also project a sense of confidence as well, which could be related to that category of delivery I spoke of earlier. So the first speech paragraph for each recording was analyzed using prop software, and then I'm using descriptive statistics because I have such a small sample size to describe those changes over teaching context and over time. So that's for English pronunciation. For the multimodal discourse practices, I'm carrying out a mediated discourse analysis, specifically employing Sigrid Norris's multimodal interaction analysis. So thinking about what actions the ITAs are trying to perform in their teaching, whether that's giving an overview of the class, answering a student's question, et cetera, and then how they use different verbal or nonverbal discourse practices to mediate that action. So following Norris, I use grounded theory really to have themes emerge from the data that I had collected instead of applying things that came from an outside research context. So the data were analyzed using qualitative coding methods while keeping in mind Emery, Guerrettaz, and Bill Johnston's 4-element approach to thinking about the different elements that are involved in classroom-based research. So taking an ecological approach to classroom-based research. For those who are unfamiliar with Guerrettaz and Johnston's 2013 study, it really just identified 4 different aspects of the classroom ecology that can have an impact on the language in the classroom and the different mediated actions that are carried out. So these include participants, for example. Those are the individuals that are involved. You can think about the TAs, students that are in the classroom, the observer, in my case. The artifacts refer to physical objects, PowerPoint slides, the use of the whiteboard markers, pointing deictics to communicate or carry out mediated actions. Processes in the classroom can refer to routinized classroom activities, or even in the context of teaching, initiation, response, evaluation, or feedback type sequences, discourse processes. And then structures tend to refer to things outside the classroom that have an impact. So thinking about imposed curricula or language policy of the university, or things outside of the classroom context. For ITAs, perhaps their department and the day-to-day lessons or things they had to go over in their classes would constitute those structures. So initial coding of the data was informed by thinking about these different elements of the classroom ecology that do have an impact on the language that's carried out in classrooms. And then also by my previous understandings of ITA programs and the research I had done prior to this study. So open or initial coding of the data revealed such things as the importance of providing clear agendas, introductions, transition summaries. And what I did as I was going through, I used the constant comparative method to compare each incident from these categories to previous ones that had been coded in a similar way, to expand or collapse or further refine or add on to these categories, which resulted in my selective coding themes. So for example, these elements of providing a clear agenda, introduction, transition, summary, seemed to be important, and my observations were grouped under one bigger category of discourse organization. Other categories for my selective coding themes are the use of semiotics and other visual support, building rapport with the audience, interactive and engaging teaching styles, and ITA's own beliefs about their agency in teaching, or affordances in teaching, if you try on the word that comes out of classroom ecology research. So getting into my results. First, looking at pronunciation, and then we're going to look at the multimodal discursive practices. So these are the subjective holistic ratings, which are reported as composite scores. So an analysis of the holistic ratings suggests that pronunciation did change for these participants in their micro-teaching lectures, which they carried out in the ITA program as kind of a benchmark assessment, but did not noticeably change as much in teaching observations except for one participant, Farzan. So looking at here, we have our averaged composite scores for intelligibility, which is under language proficiency. We see for each of the participants this upward trajectory that I highlighted with these arrows for the micro-teaching lectures. However, if you look at how they were rated by the trained raters who are not in the ITA program, we see some increase for Farzan. We do see that increase from time 1 to time 3, her first observation, teaching observation, and the third one that I recorded. But for the other 2 participants, there's more mixed results. Javier was actually rated very, very consistently in his authentic teaching observations, given almost the same score each time. It's marginally lower on the third, but it looks really consistent across. Suyan, our third participant, actually decreased over time in terms of how she was rated on that rating form. Delivery, however, which can be related to teaching skills and projected confidence and engagement with the audience, that did trend upward across participants. Suyan did receive the same score in terms of her delivery or teaching skills for micro-teachings 1 and 3, but in her authentic teaching observations, she was rated marginally higher, and then the other participants as well were rated higher as the semester went on and across teaching contexts. In addition to these holistic ratings, I also looked at shifts in those acoustic correlates of intelligibility that I measured with PROT. I realized as I was practicing this that this is actually very hard to see. So I blew up these images and I'm going to go through one by one. But in general, as I'm talking about these things, it seems that pitch range and mean intensity did not change much at all in their authentic teaching observations, whereas there is some change in their micro teaching lectures. It's kind of similar to the holistic ratings that we saw. So I'm going to blow up these and go through one by one and talk through the descriptive statistics that support those more holistic ratings, I think. So in terms of the first participant, here we have box and whisker plots, which are visual displays of 5-number summaries of pitch values. So a 5-number summary includes the minimum and maximum value of pitch, as well as a couple other statistics, including the first quartile, which is the 25th percentile, the median or the 50th percentile, if we were to line up all the pitch values from the lowest to the highest, and then the third quartile with 75th percentile of pitch values. Again, if we range those lowest to highest. You can see this a little bit here. So the minimum and maximum values are represented at the ends of these whiskers for the box and whisker plots. And then the box represents the range from the first quartile, the 25th percentile, to the third quartile, which is referred to as the IQR or interquartile range. And the reason why it's important for me to stress this point is I'm looking at that in terms of variation in pitch. Because if you think about it, if you are analyzing a speech segment and someone happens to start with a very high pitch and then drops and then is actually rather very consistent and monotone for the rest of the speech segment, you're still going to get those extreme values. And so if you have only a representation of pitch range from extremes, that might actually misrepresent actual pitch range over time. So the greater the interquartile value means that there's a greater range of pitch values, meaning that participants had more consistent variation, which is an interesting kind of two words to have together, but consistently varied their pitch over the speech segment. So if we're looking at micro teaching lectures for Farzan, here we see actually greater pitch range across her micro teaching lectures with her IQR of 85 points difference between the pitch value at the third quartile and the pitch value at the first quartile, which is actually almost double what we see in her other teaching contexts. In her teaching observations, her interquartile range is actually rather consistent, which we can see here as displayed on the graph. And then even in her mirroring project recording, where she's trying to kind of combine these different elements of pronunciation that she'd been working on from the language labs in the ITA program into a final video recording, we see a relatively compressed pitch range over that speech segment. For Javier, similar findings where we're seeing that he has greater range in his first and third micro teaching demonstrations, as I've highlighted here, in the 50s in terms of differences between pitch values. But then in his actual teaching practices, we see a lower and more compressed, narrow pitch range in terms of his interquartile range, and then the lowest in his mirroring project. Suyan as well, we see the greatest in her micro-teaching number 3, and then other noticeable differences in micro-teaching number 1 and the first trial version of her mirroring project, where we see more variation in terms of pitch than we do in her other teaching contexts that I observed, and then the other mirroring project recordings or micro-teaching lectures. Like the results from pitch range, it seems that if you look at the correlates of mean intensity over time, which we perceive as volume, that also does not seem to change as much in actual teaching settings, with the exception of Farzan, actually. She's the exception for both cases so far. So looking at these mean intensity values, you can see that for micro teachings across all three, actually, they're pretty consistent, which thinking about the context of micro teachings, it's in a smaller room. There's maybe upwards of 5 audience members. There's not a need to really shout or project so much. And so it seems that it's pretty reasonable that there's not that much variation, especially if they begin micro teaching number 1 with an adequate volume and they're not receiving notes on speaking up. Farzan actually did in her authentic teaching context, she collected early term feedback and did get notes from her students that they couldn't hear her in the back of the room. And so she learned to project her voice more. So that's something that came out of the interview with her, and something that you can see here too in terms of her mean volume level, intensity level over time. For the other participants, we just relatively see no change in both micro teaching demonstrations and teaching observations. So it could be that they began the semester already with adequate volume, adequate projected self-confidence as they were teaching. But the takeaway here, I think, is that we're not observing change over time for 2 of the 3 participants. So in addition to those shifts in L2 English pronunciation, to complement that analysis, I also looked for changes in participants' multimodal discursive practices, specifically focusing on aspects that were highlighted in the ITA program, things that they were looking for in the micro-teaching demonstrations to see if things that were stressed as important in those benchmark assessments seemed to carry over to students' actual teaching. So again, this is using those selective coding themes, and then I include some description of those themes here. This is actually a very messy table, and so I want to apologize for that. I'm still trying to workshop how to best present this in a way that's not so chaotic. So apologies about that. But I'm going to walk through things that I'm kind of highlighting and noticing from this table, and then share out with some general takeaways and go from there. So looking at our first participant again, Farzan. For Farzan, there are some things that she was taught to do specifically for her mirroring project that did not carry over to her teaching, at least on the days that I observed her teaching, I should say. So one of these things had to do with discourse organization. So for example, one stress point was to provide a summary of the class content at the end of the class. And she did this in her final and third micro teaching. But this is not something that she ever did in her classroom teaching, at least on those days that I observed. Another point that was stressed in the ITA program was the use of what is formally referred to as ARAG, which is a method of responding to students' questions in class. It stands for acknowledge, rephrase, so that you confirm that you understood the question correctly and that maybe other people in the classroom can hear you, answer the question, and then go back and check to make sure that you answered their question and there's not lingering confusion or something like that. So whereas Farzan did do this in her micro teachings, this is not ever something that she did. She would answer the questions. She wouldn't ignore questions in her class. I want to stress that, but she didn't carry over this technique or practice of the 4-part of ARAG. Of course, there are some things that she did carry over and did improve on in her teaching. One of the things that she remarked on in the interview and that I noticed as well in the recordings was that she began, in addition to her slides, to use other use of visual support, such as the whiteboard. She said that this really engaged her students more, whereas they would kind of glaze over as she went through her slides, actually using a physical whiteboard and marking things that she thought were important in class. They seemed to pay more attention to that. So that's something that she did in her third micro teaching and carried over as well. She also was more engaging as the semester went on. This is because at the beginning of the semester, she was largely reading from her slides, word from word, and not really looking at her audience. In her first observation, she was really focused and glued to those slides until the slides were done. And then she'd go out into the audience and interact and ask and answer questions and things like that as they worked on classroom activities. But that's something that definitely improved over the course of the semester for her. And something she remarked on as well in her interview with me. For the second participant, Javier, he did some things well from the beginning. He actually came into the semester, it seemed, with very good teaching skills, but not all of the things that were stressed in the micro teachings carried over to his actual teaching practices. Like Farzan, he never summarized at the end of class, really. He did the first time I observed, but then the second two times, there was an abrupt ending. In terms of eye contact and engagement, he was actually very engaging in his micro teaching demonstrations. But then when I observed his actual teaching, he largely spent a lot of the time writing on the whiteboard these different theorems and proofs, mathematics for economics or understanding economics. And so he'd spent a lot of the class time actually with his back turned towards his audience and silently writing. So he didn't have as much engagement or eye contact in that context. He also did something very well during his micro teaching. He would contextualize the different ideas, concepts, abstract ideas with real world examples. That's not something he ever carried over to his actual teaching. And then, like Farzan, he never used that AREG. And then for the last participant, Suyan, there are some things that she actually did very well that did carry over to her teaching. She became a lot more interactive in terms of her teaching, using a lot of questions. So in her classroom, she was largely solving these physics equations with students. And she began to use a lot more leading questions, asking students to give answers, explain their thinking, not just rhetorical things like right or does that make sense. So toward the end, she was really having them participate in the solving of those problems instead of doing them for the students to watch her. She also began to use classroom assessment techniques that she learned in the ITA program to check in with students at the end of each class. She would hand out these slips of paper and ask them to write down a question they still had, a comment, or just return the blank slip back to her at the end of the class. And she did this for the whole second half of the semester, she said. So a lot of things that she did well, some things that didn't carry over as much, was the use of summaries, the use of real world examples to contextualize some of the more abstract ideas or why you would need these equations or ways to solve these problems. And then again, the use of AREG. So general findings from just that overview suggest that those multimodal discourse practices did change over time. Unlike the things that we saw with the pronunciation in participants' actual teaching context. And so all students were able to improve those aspects throughout all of their micro teachings. And then some of them were able to also improve on some of those aspects in their actual teaching practices. So that's kind of the big takeaway here. So bringing it back to this idea of affordance or constraint, which I put early on as part of the title. I know I'm not talking so much about that now, but things that may have afforded TA's ability to be more engaging, to change their pronunciation, things like that, give them the agency to do that, or maybe constrained some of those actions. That's what I'm talking about with those two terms. So I wanted to bring it back to this idea of things that afford or constrain teaching practices. So, and the impact of the ITA program specifically. So all students reported when I asked them in the interview that the ITA program actually had a very positive impact on their teaching. They didn't notice as much of a change in terms of their pronunciation, they said. that's something maybe they said, oh yeah, I need more work on my English, but they really focused on how they improved their teaching and confidence. At times, they said it was stressful to be enrolled in this program, by also teaching for the first time, while also taking PhD classes. But overall, they were very happy that they had this program and that support. Again, Farzan began to reduce her slides to focus more on classroom activities and practice and engage with students more. And she reported that the biggest change that she perceived was with her own confidence in teaching. She said, I can do it. Javier actually felt a little bit constrained throughout the semester. He reported that he wasn't actually interested in teaching as much as he is in research. So that might play a part of it. But he also said that he often didn't receive notes about what he should cover in his discussion section from his professor. So sometimes he would end up canceling class or just using the 50 minutes to answer questions that students may or may not have had. His use of the whiteboard to constrain the amount of time he was actually able to engage with the students, it seemed. Suyan changed her teaching, in her words, from a Korean style to give students more agency and choice. And she also used classroom assessment techniques. She said she learned to lead and not lecture and is more confident now. So I'm going to end it actually about here, just very quickly going over some of these big takeaways. Again, going back to the pronunciation, I'm not going to read over this to you because of time, but it seems like the pronunciation aspect actually did not change so much. So you can think about why that might be. There's decades history of variationist SLA research that shows that change in context, change in task, change in interlocutor can change language performance. So it might be that. It also might be related to identity. 2 of the 3 participants remarked that change in pronunciation to them was a change in identity and not something that they felt comfortable with. Javier said explicitly that he was not trying to pass for an American, so he didn't want to sound like one. Farzan said that in Farsi, that pitch reflects intense emotions, and so she didn't want to have a high or varied pitch. So I think if we're thinking about the goal of these programs being pronunciation-based, then maybe some more identity-building, contextualized activities where participants are creating a new identity as they learn aspects of English pronunciation would be the takeaway from there. Because the more bottom-up or discrete focus and practice on smaller elements of pronunciation didn't seem to carry over to their actual teaching. The other big takeaway is that for multimodal discursive practices, there's actually a lot of good teaching practice that they were able to apply. Overwhelmingly, all students reported that they were more confident in their teaching, which we know relates to self-efficacy and impacts on their teaching performance and students' achievement. So that's a very big plus. They also reported that the ITA program itself gave them a good model of what good teaching looked like. One of the participants, Farzan, actually said that she tried to channel one of the ITA program teachers and think about what she would do as she was teaching, which was very cool. So I think if we're thinking about this program as being really impactful in terms of students' achievement in teaching and those teaching skills, then I also question why such programs might not be open to all teaching assistants and are only reserved for international teaching assistants. As we know, just because someone may have grown up speaking English does not mean that they have those good teaching skills. That seems as a big focus of this ITA program. So I know I'm kind of over my 40 minutes, and so I really want to end it here and open it up for questions. And I'm happy to go back to and re-explain anything for people who are interested.
Thanks, Darren. So there are a lot of questions in the chat, many of them very specific about the results, some of them more broad about the results, but I'm going to start with the first question that was asked from Elaine that connects back to some of the background information that you gave. And she asked, since 1985, do you think that Minnesotans have become more used to listening to a range of different accents? so that when they enter their University of Minnesota classes and hear different accents, they bring with them better listening skills?
Yes, of course. I do believe that. And I also believe that in terms of just kind of on a global scale, there's a lot more access to English kind of around. And so many of the international students that are coming to study here probably have a lot more background in terms of language than they may have had in 1985. So I think it goes both ways. But yeah, I definitely think that that plays a role in terms of not having that deficit-oriented view of international students that we saw in news media early on.
And then there's a question from Anne about the training that the ITAs received. So the question is, what kind of training do they receive in terms of pronunciation? Was it presented as accent suppression or improving comprehensibility and intelligibility?
Very good question. It is focused on intelligibility, improving comprehensibility to be understood to their audiences. And so a lot of it is, there are some things with like key words from disciplines that they identify. Each of the international teaching assistants identify key words that come up in their teaching so they can practice those specifically, which have to do more with maybe the individual sounds of English language. But then the other things that are practiced are more super segmental. So looking at word stress or sentence stress, highlighting new or important information, things like that. So not accent reduction, no. So that was very early on. They realized that, you can have an accent and still be very easily understood, but you can't have, you can still, even if a Minnesotan, for example, if I didn't have an accent per se, which I know that I do, I can still be very difficult to understand if I don't have these other elements of intelligibility.
Right.
So yeah, very early on, it was focused on intelligibility.
So that question kind of leads to the sort of broad question about the results. And Mandy and Amanda are asking questions related to the similar part of the study, which is about how you operationalize these linguistic measures, right? Mm-hmm. So the question that Mandy asks is, I'm thinking about the relationship between linguistic measures or multimodal discourse practices and raters' evaluations. Is there a relationship or correlation? If not, what else might be contributing to changes in how their intelligibility and delivery are perceived?
That's a good question. I think that, if we're looking at those objective acoustic measurements, that's just from the verbal side of language. Language is a lot more than the verbal aspects. And so I think if you're thinking about someone's improved intelligibility or comprehensibility, there's a lot that goes into that. Their use of other semiotics, including deictics pointing to keywords that are on PowerPoint screens. Their overall delivery of that content can improve a lot, even if things like the volume that they project in the classroom or the actual pitch range, they can remain very monotone, I suppose, but still increase their intelligibility a lot in terms of their use and techniques, especially if they know that, pitch range is something that's difficult for them or makes them feel a little bit uncomfortable. They can maybe rely more on the semiotics, like use of artifacts or other materials to convey their meaning. So I think that the trends that I saw in terms of, how they were rated support, because we didn't see as much of a shift in terms of the acoustic correlates in the teaching observations like we saw in the micro teachings, and they weren't rated the same either by the subjective raters. So it seems like there's a relationship there, but I think that the idea of intelligibility is not just verbal. So I want to stress that.
So we have time for one last question, and this one is kind of about your method, your data collection methods. So Colleen asks, how did you ensure consistency in the choice of the first several minutes of the authentic teaching? For instance, it could be housekeeping or delivery of content. Did you control for that? Each type of content might result in different language teaching results.
Yes, that is true. And so that was exactly that. So across in terms of micro teaching demonstrations that I analyzed the first speech paragraph, that always began with an agenda of what they were going to cover or reminders about in the last class or teaching demonstration, we did this. And so those are the same things that I looked at in terms of their actual teaching, where they kind of set up the class, had reminders about upcoming exams or other housekeeping items, and then went into their agenda. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. We've come to the end of our time together. So thank you, Darren, for this great study. It's so interesting that I can't wait to hear more about your findings as you continue doing your dissertation research. And thank you to everybody for being here today. So thanks a lot and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. And if there's anyone who has other questions, you can feel free to email me.